Hello, welcome. We are now going to do some English language A-level work on the Discourses paper, and this is a feedback and guidance on the paper 2, section B, Discourses section. And what we're going to do is we're going to look through the 2017 Discourses paper. I'm going to give you some advice about, how to do this properly and how to improve upon your Discourses answers generally. This is what the papers look like. So we have this one, young women. Give up the vocal fry and reclaim your strong female voice, put next to, do women really talk like 12-year-old girls? So the first thing to note is what the publications are. So because that's obviously a key contextual factor, which is probably going to be influencing the language and the stance. So the first one, Text A, is from the Daily Mail. It's from the Mail Online. So the Daily Mail is a British tabloid blue top newspaper. It's not quite as sensationalist, may it be, as the Sun or the Daily Mirror, but it's a tabloid newspaper and it tends to appeal to more conservative readers. Okay, conservative with both a small and large C. So that's your Daily Mail, and then you've got your Text B, which is from The Guardian. Now, The Guardian is a broadsheet newspaper, so it tends to be a bit more sophisticated sometimes in its presentation of ideas. And what else about The Guardian? Well, it tends to be quite liberal and progressive, and it tends to be read by more left-leaning, i.e. more Labour-supporting sorts of readers. All of these things may have an impact on the language that's being used and the stance that's being chosen by the journalists, possibly. The question is, analyse how language is used in Text A and Text B to present views about women's language. Now, worth dwelling a little bit on the AOs. Now, you've got 3 AOs on this. You've got A01, which is out of 10, and this is your key terms. So do you know your deontic modal auxiliary verbs from your second person pronouns? If you do, all well and good, because it shows that you are a proper English language A-level student. So know your key terms, and also it's about written expression as well. So technical accuracy, are you putting your possessive apostrophes in the right place? Are you using semicolons, etc.? But also, are you writing in paragraphs with proper topic sentences at the beginning? Okay, so 10 out of your 40 marks are for AO1, key terms and written expression. Now, what is AO3, I hear you ask? This is all about your understanding of ideas. So how language creates meanings and representations. Now, I know paper 1, section A is all about meanings and representations, but so is this, because you've got to show the examiner that you really understand the ideas that are going on. So what ideas are being presented by the journalists, and also how have contextual factors influenced the language and the ideas, e.g. the kind of publication that this article is from. AO4, on the other hand, which is also worth 15, is about links. So it's about comparisons, the similarities and differences between the two texts in terms of the language usage, in terms of the context, in terms of the stances of the writers. So there are your AOs. Now, here are the texts. Do women really talk like 12-year-old girls? Actress Lake Bell insists there is a vocal pandemic of adults talking in baby voices. Now, headlines do a certain job, don't they? They have to be quite strident and eye-catching. Otherwise, nobody's going to read the article. So this is what this one is doing. It's quite a hyperbolic, eye-catching, engaging headline. It starts off with an interrogative. So you've got direct address here where you're being asked a question. And it's making an assertion that female voices are childish and immature. So it's that kind of deficit idea that there's something weak about female language. But, however, notice the intensifying adverb there. The intensifying adverb indicates skepticism on the journalist's behalf. They're questioning this assertion that people are making that women's language sounds weak. We've got a reference to a famous name, a celebrity, who of course I've never heard of, actress Notice the so-called trivializing suffix put on the end of the word actor in order to foreground that this is a woman that is speaking. And we have Lake Bell insisting. She's not just saying or stating, she is insisting. So there's quite dogmatic, certain kind of stance that's being used in that verbal verb. And what have we got here in terms of discourses? Well, a pandemic. So we know all about those, don't we? So this is the discourse of infection, which is one of those three metaphors that Jean Aitchison drew attention to: crumbling castle, damp spoon, and infection. That when people are writing or talking about language, they often criticize language as being in decline because of those things. We then get stuck into the article. From Valley Girls to the Kardashians, young women are often mocked for the way that they talk. So we've got an adverbial at the beginning there, which is supposed to show the breadth of, where young women are being mocked, but actually it's a very narrow kind of expression, because Valley Girls and Kardashians, if I'm not wrong, it's both West Country America, okay, California. So it's putting center stage here young women, the language of young women, and it's using the passive voice. It's saying that young women are under attack, that people disapprove of the way that they are speaking. Notice the kind of personalized low register tone that we've got here. So we've got a sentence and paragraph that begins with a coordinating connective and. So this is a kind of cohesive device that's dragging us through the article. We have Lake Bell, and Lake Bell's authority is being drawn attention to here with the movie that she's been in. And here it's showing an assertion. So this is not a linguist who's drawing upon a swathe of linguistic data, but instead it's a celebrity who is making an assertion. And the assertion is backing up this idea of the pandemic, that young women everywhere have caught chronic, and then we've got these inverted commas around sexy baby vocal virus. So the noun phrase there is obviously quoting something that Lake Bell has said. It's like a speech pattern that includes up talking and fry. So it's this amalgamation of really unsavory sounds that many young women have adopted. It's a pandemic, in my opinion, the 34-year-old told NPR. So then we've got the direct voice of Lake Bell. So her opinion is being foregrounded here. There are some assumptions being made here that you as a reader understand what is meant by up talking and fry. So presumably in the rest of the article, these are going to be explained. But again, it's this notion, the discourse of disapproval. So the sounds of women are being criticised here. Notice the pre-modifying adjective, unsavoury. Okay, the actress who wrote, directed and starred in the upcoming film Inner World says she is worried that women are hurting their careers by talking like little girls. So we've got this as the beginning of text A, and this is coupled with the Guardian one, which starts like this: young women, give up the vocal fry and reclaim your strong female voice. Now notice the direct address that we've got here. And just as I said on text A, it uses quite a dogmatic, strident tone. This does even more so. We've got the direct address of young women, so it's as if this article is just being directed towards a particular gender. We've got the use of the imperative verbs, so we've got the prepositional verb give up and reclaim. So we've got direct imperatives here. And we've got the use of the second person singular and plural pronoun, your. Okay, and what's interesting here is this juxtaposition of strong and female, because if females are being criticized for having a weak voice, then actually what she's trying to do is challenge that and say, look, intrinsically, instinctively, female voices are strong. So they're interesting pre-modifying adjectives that's being used. There's your headline. This is your byline. What's heartbreaking about the trend for destructive speech patterns is that yours is the most transformational generation. You're disowning your power. Wow, look at all those second person pronouns. Yours, your. So there's a very direct address that we've got here, and very hyperbolic language that's being used. Notice this, this pre-modifying adjective heartbreaking as well. So quite extreme claims being made and direct language. So patriarchy is inventive. And incidentally, notice here the use of the good old copular verb. The copular verb is the verb to be when it says A equals B. And so this is often used by people who are trying to persuade you over to a certain position. Again, it's a very certain kind of stance. It's not saying, patriarchy could be considered as inventive. No, it's patriarchy is inventive. So this is called the copular verb. Look out for it. When you read examiners' reports, they often point out the use of the, good students are pointing out the copular verb. The minute a generation of women has figured out how not to be enslaved by ideology A, some new cultural pressure arises in the form of internalization B, making sure that they don't get too far, too fast. Okay, so interesting use of language here, talking about ideology A and internalization B. It's a little bit like a kind of sociology lecture that we've got going on here. And again, we've got strong hyperbolic language being used here. Now, notice this material verb, the passive material verb here, talking about women being enslaved. And then we move into the last part of the paragraph where it says, the latest example, which is a good example of cataphoria. What is the example? Well, let's find out. There's a colon. The most empowered generation of women ever. That's quite a strong superlative adjectival phrase that's being used there. Today's 20-somethings in North America and Britain is being hobbled in some important ways by something as basic as new fashion in how they use their voices. Okay, so interesting use again of an idiomatic verb being hobbled, so the passive voice being ruined or destroyed there, being hobbled. So it's drawing attention to the fact, if it is a fact, that this trend is actually limiting women from getting on in the world. It's a fascinating article, and you can see great linkages with the text A1. Now then, here are some of my tips on how to do a really good answer when you're deconstructing these two articles. My first tip is this, that at the beginning in your intro paragraph, what you need to do is you need to start off with a clear comparative overview of the arguments in the two texts. That's really important that you summarize. You've got an overview, so you don't just start writing about the headline, but you've got an overview of the two texts. And you're able to identify the key contextual influences on the language. What do you mean, Paul? I mean, who are the implied audiences? What are some of the primary and secondary purposes of the articles? And what are the genres of the two pieces? These are the key contextual influences, which are going to be pretty important in your opening paragraph. Now, let me give you an example of what I mean. Here we go. So both texts present competing arguments about language, gender and power, with particular focus on attitudes towards vocal fry and uptalk. The Mail Online, the electronic version of a right-wing middle-brow tabloid newspaper, explores both non-linguists and specialists' prescriptive and descriptive perspectives, whereas the Guardian piece from a left-wing broadsheet newspaper argues a largely prescriptive viewpoint about the effects of using what is perceived to be female talk. Now, this is good, isn't it? Because it starts with a clear comparative overview statement about the whole texts. That first sentence really shows a really good overview about what's going on in the two articles. And it also, in the second sentence, draws attention to the key contextual aspects about the genre, that this is a newspaper article, and also about the audience as well. And then thirdly, it shows some of the similarities and differences in the viewpoints, because it's introducing adjectives like prescriptive and descriptive. That's a pretty good start. So I would advise you to be starting your pieces in a similar kind of way. Clear comparative overview, draw attention to key contextual aspects, and have a go at pinning, if relevant, ideas of prescriptivism or descriptivism to what you've read. Tip number 1. Right, tip number 2 coming your way. Now clearly, since the A04 is about comparison, and that's 15 out of your 40 marks, you've got to build your essay around 5 or 6 comparative topic sentences. And I say unto you, if you've got those topic sentences nailed on at the very beginning, let's say you're spending 10 to 15 minutes planning this thing, if you know what your topic sentence is, well, your essay is going to be a good one. Okay, so here are some examples. Both headlines use direct address and hyperbole, incidentally that's the way you pronounce it, not hyperbole, hyperbole, to suggest the supposed weakness of women's speech. Now that is a beautiful, beautiful topic sentence, because you're just going to be looking at the headlines there, and it's identifying something in the headlines and linking it into the idea of the text, which is about the weakness of women's speech. So that's a nice place to do it. The quoted commentators in both texts use the discourse of criticism in representing female speech. Now we like that because it's got the word discourse in it, and this is the discourse section. When we use the word discourse, we really mean semantic field. Okay, so one of your topic sentences, try and shove the word discourse in there. Both texts quote anecdotal evidence to suggest pejorative responses to female speech. Now, pejorative is a good alternative word for negative. Okay, so here it's saying in both of the texts, you've got anecdotal evidence, you've got people talking about their own experiences, and in that experience, they seem to be suggesting a negative response to female speech. And here is a fourth example. So the Mail Online closes the article by exploring the strengths of women's speech, whereas the Guardian ends by highlighting gender inequality as the central issue. Now, I've put that one in because it shows that you've read the whole articles, because too often students just write forever about the headlines and the byline and the first paragraph, and of course they forget to write about the rest of the article. Big mistake, because you will find that in an article like this, the arguments develop, and the arguments that you've got in the last third of the article might be quite different to the ideas that you've got at the very beginning. So there's your tip. Build your essay around 5 or 6 comparative topic sentences. Now let me give you another tip. Embed your A01 terms in every sentence. Every sentence? Yes, every sentence, to analyse the language of specific quotation. So this is where you're showing off. You're showing off that you're an A-level student. You're a proper A-level student. And this is how you're going to do it. So both texts quote anecdotal evidence to suggest pejorative responses to today's female speech. There's your topic sentence. Now the bits in blue here are your A01 terms, and you can see here that there's those blue bits in every single sentence. So your examiner is liking that. They're going tick, tick, tick all the way through. In text A, the use of the deontic modal auxiliary verb. In the quotation, a female voice should sound sophisticated and sexy, shows how current adult female speech has supposedly declined from previous expectations. So it's honing in on a particular bit of language, it's labeling it correctly, but it's also saying something about the ideas behind it. Beautiful. The sibilant post-modifying adjectives sophisticated and sexy suggest past female ideals of power and culture. Now we're drawing on these A01 terms on different language levels. Do you notice? So sibilant, that's to do with phonology, it's to do with the sound of the word, and if it's got S's in, we know from our literature study that's sibilance. So that's sibilant, so that's the adjective form. So that's from the phonological language level, but it's also in terms of lexis and grammar here, post-modifying adjectives. Notice in the next sentence here that we're not just saying the verb, but we're saying the mental verb. The mental verb placate in Kate Fridless's anecdote about mixed gender street conversations indicates that females feel required to use language to manage male responses. In text B, anecdotes illustrate the annoyance of listeners to females, the intensifying adverb and pejorative adjective conveying the strength of negative feeling towards women's speech. How can this examiner not give you a high mark when your language knowledge is so strong about the nuts and bolts of A01? Okay, so embed A01 terms, not just occasionally, but in every single sentence. That's what Paul says. Now here's a fourth tip. This word discourse, we mentioned it before. Use this noun discourse frequently because, this is called discourse, and therefore the expectation is that you're going to be using discourse all the way through. Okay, so here we've got a paragraph. 1, 2, 3, 4. We have 4 instances of the word discourse being used. For example, both texts represent female speech through the discourse of power. In text B, the superlative adjectival phrase, the most empowered generation of women ever, argues that American and British females are in danger of squandering a historically unique position of relative power simply through their speech patterns. This discourse of power is reiterated in the last paragraph with the noun gatekeepers and the noun phrase male-dominated fields, suggesting that ultimate control is male. In text A, the first sentence passive verb phrase are often mocked reflects this discourse of power, showing how female speech is being perceived as weak. The discourse of female powerlessness is represented in the noun phrase markers of immaturity or stupidity, assigning low status to uptalk and the use of the word like. So we've got 3, 4 sentences. We've repeated the word discourse 4 times. We've convinced our marker that we know what we're talking about on discourse. It's kind of an alternative to semantic fields. Okay, so when you look at the examiner's report on this, and incidentally, the examiner is not Winston Churchill. He died in 1964, but I put that in because I love the quotation. Success is stumbling from failure to failure with no loss of enthusiasm. What a fantastic quotation that is. Success is stumbling from failure to failure with no loss of enthusiasm. Persevere, don't give up. So your weakest question 3 answers didn't really engage with what the texts were actually saying. So they might have pointed out a lot of style features, like, direct address is being used, and look at those second person pronouns, but they may not have engaged with what the texts were actually saying. Also, your weak answers use very few linguistic descriptions, so they might have identified a verb, but did they identify that this was a verbal verb or a mental verb? Probably not. And also, your question 3 answers get dragged into question 4, i.e. they start writing about research and theories about women's language. Question 3 is not the place to be showing off your language about deficit, dominance, and diversity models. No, 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 be patient. You will use that information in your question 4 response. The other thing I mentioned before is that question 3, weaker answers often write too much about the opening parts of the text and neglect the ends of the text. And also, look, you're writing at speed, but you've got to keep control over your technical accuracy. Spell words like woman correctly, or punctuate the word women's if it needs an apostrophe possessive. Okay, now in terms of, what the good answers are doing, on this particular one, they identified that the Daily Mail text actually is more informative than the persuasive or argumentative Guardian text. So the Guardian text is an opinion article, whereas the Mail one is a piece of reportage, so it's informational, but containing some ideas, some arguments. So there's a subtle difference in purpose between the two of them. The best answers also understood that what you've got in both of the texts is actually a collage of views. it's a variety of different views. It's impossible to say, well, text A is prescriptive or descriptive, because actually what you've got is an amalgamation of a whole range of different texts which are mediated by the writer. Good answers chose the right sorts of discourses and metaphors to write about. So they evaluated the metaphors of disease, enslavement, and fashion that we see going through these texts. And they also evaluated the text treatment of women as a homogeneous group, because quite often the voices in these articles are talking about female language as if, females all use the same sort of language. They're a homogeneous group. Okay, so the examiner particularly identified those areas. Okay, so hopefully that has been useful for you, and obviously I haven't gone on to question 4, which is the opinion article. Maybe I will do that on another day in another video. Who knows? I'll keep you guessing on that. Thank you very much.